In 1969, the US government quietly backed one of the strangest aviation studies ever put on paper. The mission was blunt and ambitious. Find out how big an airplane could realistically get, and what a monster aircraft like that could mean for American air power. The company leading the charge was Lockheed, already famous inside defense circles for building the kind of cutting-edge, often secret aircraft that rarely showed up in public. And what they sketched out was so extreme it still sounds like a rumor even today. The Lockheed CL-1201, a concept for a nuclear-powered airborne attack carrier, so huge it would have rewritten the definition of an airplane. To understand why anyone even entertained this idea, you have to remember the era. The 1960s were a turbocharged decade for aerospace. Engineers weren't just chasing speed, they were chasing scale. The US was fielding aircraft that seemed impossibly large at the time, like the new Lockheed C-5, a heavyweight transport that made almost everything else look small. And the logic in certain Pentagon circles was simple. If we can build aircraft this big now, what happens when aerodynamics improve, materials get stronger, and propulsion takes a leap forward? Cold War pressure poured fuel on that thinking. The United States and the Soviet Union were spending staggering amounts to gain any advantage. Spy planes that could fly higher and faster, bombers that could carry more weapons farther, and systems that could respond instantly anywhere on Earth.
I don't know, but it's
The goal
huge.
wasn't just power, it was reach. And reach was the entire point of America's strategy of containment. If trouble flared up somewhere, anywhere, the US wanted to have forces ready to respond, fast. Traditionally, that meant carrier battle groups, floating airfields that could steam toward a crisis and put jets over the fight. But as the Cold War intensified, the map started to look dangerously unstable in more places at once. And the farther the problem, the longer the response time. That's where Lockheed's wild proposal comes in. Their study imagined an aircraft so large it wouldn't just carry troops or cargo. It would function like an aircraft carrier in the sky. Not metaphorically, literally. A flying platform that could launch and support combat aircraft and act as a command hub while hauling an absurd amount of equipment. The numbers attached to this thing are almost comical. A gross weight approaching 6,000 tons and a wingspan around 1,100 feet. Well, over 3 football fields wide. In other words, not an airplane you'd park. More like an airbase that happened to fly. And here's where the mystery deepens. Lockheed's original report has essentially vanished. Even the Department of Defense reportedly has no clear record of it. It's the kind of detail that makes the CL-1201 feel like a ghost project, something that existed just long enough to be referenced, then slipped behind layers of classification, misfiling, or plain old disappearance. Still, later aerospace studies referenced the concept just enough for people to reconstruct the outline of what Lockheed had in mind. And what they were pitching wasn't a gimmick. It was a doctrine. A CL-1201 force would give the United States the ability to move hundreds of fully equipped troops, plus vehicles, supplies, and firepower, across the world in hours, not days. And then, once on station, it could launch combat aircraft on demand without waiting for an ocean carrier to arrive. Lockheed even laid out a scenario. An organized uprising erupts far from the US, backed or stirred by Soviet influence. Normally, America would surge a naval task force and Marines. But in this scenario, the Mediterranean is effectively cut off, and nearby foreign bases are either denied or unusable. The usual playbook fails. So instead of pushing a fleet through contested waters and negotiating access one airfield at a time, a flying attack carrier launches straight from the continental United States, crosses the Atlantic, and sets up an aerial staging area over the Mediterranean, an American air operation that doesn't need permission to land. Within hours, the carrier arrives carrying a mix of aircraft and long-range weapons, establishing air superiority and operating as a flying command center. Alongside it would be a group of massive transports, logistic support aircraft, each one essentially a moving warehouse and barracks. Think about that for a second. Not one transport, but a coordinated package of giant aircraft moving like a system. Each logistic support aircraft would be built to haul hundreds of troops, hundreds more specialized crew, and around 1,000 tons of equipment and supplies, enough to sustain operations for weeks. The idea wasn't just get there fast. It was arrive ready to fight, and keep fighting without waiting for a pipeline. Of course, an aircraft this huge collides with one immediate problem: runways. Even if you could build the CL-1201, what airfield on Earth could handle something that big? Lockheed's answer was to avoid needing traditional runways as much as possible by giving the aircraft short takeoff and landing capability through brute force. They envisioned dozens of auxiliary turbofan engines embedded in the wings and forward fuselage, producing massive vertical thrust for takeoff and landing. Then, once airborne, enormous high-bypass turbofans would push the aircraft along at a cruise speed comparable to modern jet transports. So far, it's already extreme. But the real, how is this even legal to think about, moment comes next. Because the CL-1201 wasn't just meant to fly across the world. It was meant to stay there, loitering for up to 30 days without landing. 30 days. That requirement is what drove the most controversial part of the design: nuclear propulsion. Lockheed engineers proposed a reactor roughly 30 feet in diameter rated in the tens of thousands of megawatts, conceptually related to submarine reactor technology, but scaled to something that belongs in a power station. The plan was to use conventional jet fuel during takeoff and landing, then switch to nuclear-powered operation at higher altitude, above roughly 16,000 feet. Heat from the reactor would be transferred through exchangers and coolant loops so the engines could run either on fuel or on reactor heat, while the reactor sat inside containment and shielding meant to limit exposure to the crew. Lockheed even argued that altitude was part of the safety strategy. If an accident happened, there would be time to shut the reactor down before impact. They described the system as fail-safe, an astonishing claim considering what's at stake when you put a reactor inside an aircraft the size of a skyscraper laid on its side. And while the attack carrier and those giant support aircraft stayed aloft, other conventional transports would arrive to keep the operation moving. Over the staging area, smaller medium transports would rendezvous with the big logistics aircraft to transfer troops and supplies, mid-air docking, airborne handoffs, and even tow connections to keep assets positioned and ready. The CL-1201's broad, blended wing configuration was framed as an advantage here, a stable platform for this kind of aerial choreography. Then the combat phase begins. Carrier-based strike aircraft would work with Allied ground forces to smash enemy defenses and carve out a secure airfield. Once that airfield is usable, the medium transports shuttle troops and equipment down from the loitering logistics aircraft, while carrier-based fighters provide cover. In Lockheed's vision, the CL-1201 and its support fleet would be too high, too far, and too well defended for enemies to threaten directly. Operating at around 30,000 feet and kept hundreds of miles from hostile forces, the carrier would be protected by fighters, layered missile defenses, and, in the most Cold War sentence imaginable, laser weapons. The end state was just as bold as the aircraft itself. Within 30 days, U.S. and Allied troops stabilize the region, reopen sea lanes, and enable a conventional naval force to move in once conditions are safer. And if you're thinking, okay, but how would any of this work in real life? You're not alone. Even supporters of the concept have pointed out glaring practical questions. How would the onboard aircraft be rearmed and serviced during sustained combat operations? How would smaller aircraft safely dock or transfer near a machine that would generate wake turbulence on a scale no pilot has ever experienced? What does maintenance look like when your power source is a reactor and your airframe is bigger than most ships? The deeper you dig, the stranger it gets. And that's what makes the CL-1201 so fascinating. It's not just an oversized airplane concept. It's a snapshot of a moment in history when engineers and strategists were willing, almost obligated, to ask outrageous questions, because the Cold War rewarded any idea that could deliver speed, reach, and dominance. Maybe Lockheed was responding to a specific strategic fear. Maybe the government wanted a true limits of technology study. Or maybe it really was the kind of program you assign to brilliant young engineers just to see what falls out when you remove all the usual constraints. But even among the countless speculative designs of that era, many of them never intended to be built, the CL-1201 stands apart. A flying attack carrier, a nuclear-powered airborne base, a 6,000-ton statement about what American air power could look like if the only rule was, make it bigger, make it faster to deploy, and make it impossible to ignore.